You're tuned in, Holy Smokes, Cigars, Catholicism, and Conversation. Let my prayer arise in thy sight as incense. I'm your host, Dustin Quick, and this is episode number 33. Before I introduce my very special guest, I just want to let everybody know that Havana Palace in Windsor, Ontario, Canada is the official sponsor of the Holy Smokes podcast. And right now I have one of their lovely house blends on deck. Very smooth, goes great with the coffee, which is what I'm pairing it with tonight. If you would please be so kind as to go to facebook.com/Havana Palace and give them a like, I would greatly, and they would greatly appreciate it. All right, so with that out of the way, I did take a little bit of a break as I had a week and a half vacation, so I'm glad to be back on the saddle and doing the podcast again. Hope everyone's been great, had a good time with your family and friends, and have been staying safe out there. So I have back with me again for the second time, Mike Aquilina from the St. Paul Center. And it's a pleasure to have you back, Mike. Welcome. How are you doing today?
Hey, thanks for having me back, Dustin. I'm doing fine. It's a little bit hot, a little bit humid, but I got the windows open and maybe there'll be a breeze.
Yep, I can definitely sympathize with you there. And I've got the garage door open, a nice breeze coming, and I've got a fan going. So I've got double duty here and all is well. So last time we talked about the Mass of the early Christians, and we focused on sort of the theological elements, the real presence in the Eucharist and that sort of a thing, some temple themes. But today I wanted to talk to you about the liturgy itself and its development. Mm-hmm. As Catholics today, we think about Catholicism, we think about the church, we read about the church in the past, and we think of pomp, circumstance, grand vestments, great cathedrals, stained glass windows, and all those things are wonderful and great, of course, to be sure. But I wanted to talk to you about sort of how the liturgy took shape in the church's nascent age from, say the apostolic times until the 4th century, before the legalization of Christianity, because as we know, once Christianity became legal and Christians were free to move about the empire, that's when they started getting positions of power, and they had money and were able to build houses of worship specifically designed for that purpose. But it wasn't always that way from the beginning, right?
Right. Most Christian worship took place in homes. It was modeled after the worship of the Jews in that time, of course, and that included the liturgies of the home, of the synagogue, and of the temple. There's a great passage in the JPS Torah commentary, the book on Leviticus, which was done by Baruch Levine. And in it, he says, Christianity adopted the policy of sanctifying space, as Judaism had once done. Christian worship in the form of the traditional Mass affords the devout an experience of sacrifice of communion and proclaims that God is present. The Christian church, then, is a temple. So here's Baruch Levine, who's writing in the Jewish Publication Society's volume of commentary on Leviticus, and he's pointing out that the Mass is very much seen in continuity with the temple's sacrificial liturgy.
Oh, wow, that's beautiful.
So Rabbinic Judaism went in a different direction altogether. Mm-hmm. They went in, they developed a non-sacrificial form of Judaism that was focused on the Word, much like Protestantism would kind of developed for Christianity later on. But the early Christians were very much in continuity with the liturgy of Israel as it had been celebrated, throughout the biblical era. So the Mass would have contained elements of all three of those liturgies, those locations for liturgy, and they did not have their own places. They did sanctify space eventually by building churches, but even in the house churches, I imagine they gave the liturgy as much pomp and circumstance as they could.
Yeah.
And that's what you see St. Paul struggling with in chapter 11 of 1 Corinthians, right? He's correcting the Corinthians because he sees their behavior during the liturgy as abusive. Now, these people had never never experienced the kind of solemn liturgical meal that was normal for Jews, right? During the pilgrim feasts, they would have celebrated these solemn liturgical meals in a home, with the a certain prescribed number of cups of wine that had been drunk, that had to be drunk during the liturgy of the home. That didn't make the jump into the pagan lands. It just didn't translate well for the Corinthians, and obviously they were behaving in ways that were inappropriate because they weren't used to being in this kind of place. Eusebius mentions in his history that both Saint Peter and Saint John wore the priestly ephod during the years of their ministry. So again, they wore a kind of vestment to convey their authority and their office to the people they encountered. So there was this degree of kind of specialness to
solemnity,
solemnity and difference. Holiness is simply difference. It's what's set apart for the worship of God, for the service of God, and they managed to convey that as best they could.
Right, and I could see how the Corinthians would sort of abuse the liturgy, because in paganism, in the Greco-Roman world, food is not necessarily sacred. I mean, you have these banquets with orgies, and people are just used to stuffing themselves and sort of treating it very profane.
Yes.
So I could definitely see how there would be that culture clash, with the solemn Jewish liturgical meals, as you said.
Yeah.
That's a very good point. So, what do you suppose? So let's start with like St. Paul in the scriptures. So when he would celebrate the Lord's Supper, or one of the apostles would, what do you think the setting would have been like? What would the gathering have been like? What was the tone? What really went on at these celebrations?
There's a good speculation about that in Jerome Murphy O'Connor's archaeological guide to Corinth, actually. He's talking about the Corinthian letters, and he tries to imagine what the liturgy would have been like in that time. Now, in one place, he describes the archaeological excavations of the workshops in the marketplaces, because we can see the kind of shop that Paul worked in, because we know that he was working as a tent maker during his time in Corinth. So these have been excavated. I visited these places myself, and there's a standard size to the shops in the marketplace. So you can see approximately how big it was, how much was given to frontage, and then how much was given to actually a work area where you were sewing your tents, you were making your canopies back there. So Jerome Murphy O'Connor was a priest and an archaeologist, and he does this imaginative passage where he describes a tiny liturgy, because the number of Corinthian Christians at the time Paul arrived must have been tiny. Okay, Paul is there with just a few believers, and it's lit by oil lamps. You're in the back portion, which is protected by a screen or a curtain, and he offers the liturgy that way. Now, what would the liturgy have been? We look in Acts chapter 20, and we find Paul essentially improvising the prayer. That it could very well have been like the Paschal liturgy that we have from Melito of Sardis, where it's a long telling of salvation history that culminates in the story of our Lord's offering during the Last Supper and its consummation on Calvary. So it could have been something like that. It could have been something very much like we find in the liturgy, or in the Didache, which is a liturgical document from about 48 AD, when Paul would have been performing these liturgies. So we can look at that and we can get an idea. Now, in all of these cases, we're exercising our imagination to some degree, because we're working with translations. We're trying to reconstruct cultures that were so long ago, that use technology that we don't use today, that use terminology we don't use today. They played games in ways we we don't understand today, and all of their metaphors kind of break down for us, but we do
Right.
the best we can.
So I get the sense that very early on, the Eucharist was combined with an agape meal or quote unquote love feast.
Mm-hmm.
How did that come to be? How were those two things intertwined, and what circumstances gave rise to their separation? Because eventually these things got separated somehow and for some reason.
Well, I suspect that the love feast was modeled very much on the Passover Seder, because we have wonderful accounts of the Passover Seder as it was celebrated in Jerusalem during the time of our Lord and His apostles, right?
Right.
That there were certain rules that you were supposed to strive to have so many people at your table and not fewer if you could manage that. Okay, so there was a tradition of hospitality, of bringing people in, of people eating together to celebrate the great feast. Now, again, this was a solemn meal. I have this idea. Maybe I'm not the first one to think it. That you become what you worship, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, in Greco-Roman paganism, who were they worshiping? What were they worshiping? They were worshiping gods who are portrayed on Mount Olympus or wherever as feasting gluttonously, as
Mm-hmm.
getting drunk, on
Right.
nectar, and womanizing essentially. So
Mm-hmm.
often their religious feasts turned into such occasions. They were
Right.
gluttonous, they were drunken, and they were orgies, as you said. They kind of degenerated that way, and this would have seemed normal to them, but it would not have been normal to the Jews.
Right.
The feasts were celebrated for the sake of the law, and they would have been lived according to the law. So I suspect the Passover meal was the model for
Mm-hmm.
the earliest Christian liturgy, and it was one that included hospitality, a certain measure of eating. Okay,
Right.
there were even the portions were prescribed in some of the rabbinic materials,
Right.
and the portions of the wine and how the wine was supposed to be um, diluted with water,
Right.
which was a customary thing at the time. So it was all very regulated. It was all very disciplined, and that's where you got the idea of the agape. I think again, there were problems from the very beginning with keeping discipline on that in cultures that had no experience of solemn ritual meals.
Right. Do you think that's why the agape was separated from the Eucharist ultimately, because the disciplinary thing was such a concern and it was so hard to implement that they just decided, hey, we're gonna separate these things so there's no further problems?
Oh, absolutely. First we see a separation, and then we see it vanish entirely. So it's almost as if the bishops of the church at a certain point made the decision to just give up on having that kind of meal in these uncivilized settings,
Right.
uncivilized by Jewish standards, because
Right.
these peoples were not able to assimilate this Jewish custom. So yeah, the agape meal kind of falls away. There's there we may see kind of vestiges of it in some places where there seem to have been two rites on Sunday, one early in the morning and then one later in the evening. There's
Right.
speculation that one of those would have been the rite for the Eucharist, and the other would have been the rite for the reading of the scriptures and preaching.
Interesting. So, as you mentioned early on, they didn't have their own spaces to sanctify, but they sanctified the spaces that they obviously could make use of, right?
That's right.
One of them was Roman homes. Now, when I was Protestant, we had this thing in our church where we wanted to go back to the book of Acts. So we wanted to meet in each other's homes and have fellowship that way. And we were going to recreate the Actine model, if you were. But again, the idea behind the book of Acts house church worship was we sit down with our Bibles, we drink coffee or whatever, and we let the Holy Spirit speak to us as He will and move us as He will in song and spontaneous praise, I mean, there was no like set order or anything. It was very just kind of informal, fly by the seat of your pants. I don't mean to be crass, but ultimately that's what ends up kind of happening. Because we're free in Christ. We're not bound by rules and regulations and all of that, right? So when I used to hear that the first Christians worshipped in house churches, that's kind of the idea that I had. But I suspect that's not how early Christians did home church. Can you sort of flesh out for us what would a Roman house have been like? What sort of features in the house or in a particular room? How would this have been accommodated for liturgical worship? And what would this sort of furniture have been? Was there an altar? Were there was there deacons at this early stage? Were there bishops and priests? Like what would this whole setup have looked like in your estimation?
Yeah. Again, Jerome Murphy O'Connor's book on First Corinth, or on his archaeological guide to Corinth, is so good in this regard as well, because he talks about the excavation of various kinds of houses. Now houses during the Roman era were as varied as houses today.
Yeah.
Eventually what you find is that and actually from the very beginning you find a real mix across classes from earliest Christian times. Okay. You find that there were poor Christians, there were rich Christians. This was creating part of the problem in Corinth, right? That Paul describes in chapter 11. But it's quite likely, if there were wealthy members of the church at that early time, that they would have given part of their home over to gatherings of this size. Okay, if the church is that substantial and it has wealthy members, well, you have wealthy members with a large room at the entrance of their house, which was a space for gathering. Okay?
Right.
And this is pretty typical. Again, Father Jerome has photographs of such a place and artistic reproductions or reconstructions from the archaeological digs. So you can see that it was constructed kind of like a big room with an area at the beginning that could have been used for the sacrificial part of the mass and for the preaching of whoever was leading the service, the apostle or whoever he had delegated. So that's the way I imagine it. Now, the evidence from the first generation after the apostles definitely indicates that that the worship of that first generation was liturgical, that it was ritual public worship. We have liturgical texts from that period, and we have texts that are controversial texts that are intensely concerned with liturgical propriety. Okay, think of what the earliest Christian documents are. All right. The earliest document we have is probably the Didache, right? So it's a document from Syria. The liturgical portions, scholars tell us, probably originate around 47, 48 AD, which makes at least those passages older than most of what we find in the New Testament. Okay.
Wow.
So when we see a liturgical meeting, like Acts 20 or what Paul describes in 1 Corinthians 11, we can imagine it to be a meeting like the one prescribed by the Didache. Now, the Didache has certain norms for liturgical worship. It has norms for baptism in water. It has norms for the Eucharist, and it has actual Eucharistic prayers that could be used either as a model or as the prayers themselves. We don't know. So that's the Didache. It's from very early on. After the Didache, probably the earliest document we have is Clement's letter to the Corinthians. It's sometimes called First Clement.
Right.
Clement. Now, Clement is a disciple of the apostles Peter and Paul. He was a witness to their preaching. And what we have in his letter, which is a long letter that he's writing to a distant church in Corinth, right? So it's over there in Greece, and he's he's over there in Italy, and he's writing to discipline these people, or at least exhort them to better behavior.
Right.
So once again, he's following after Paul, the model of Paul, because both Paul and Clement are disciplining the Corinthian church.
Right.
You can't let these people alone for a minute. Um, so Clement's letter is largely concerned with liturgical order.
Mm.
Who's in charge and what are the duties of the person in charge? And he's talking about the role of the bishops and how they got the authority and the power that they have. They got it through apostolic succession. He's the first to articulate this principle for us, and he's urging them to observe liturgical order as they find it in the Old Testament.
Right.
He draws models of hierarchy from the Old Testament, and then he says you can even see this in nature, and he talks about the order that we find in the winds and the tides and in everything else in nature. We should observe the same order in our worship. So Clement is writing this around 67 AD. This is still very early in the church's history. We move on from there to the other documents of the Apostolic Fathers. Barnabas, the Epistle of Barnabas, is again concerned with liturgy and worship, proper worship. We have the letters of Ignatius of Antioch, and again, we find those letters to be intensely Eucharistic. He talks about the Eucharist as the flesh of Christ, the flesh that was crucified. So he's being graphic. He's using that Greek word sarx, which you could use to describe the meat hanging in the marketplace. So he's talking about the flesh of the Lord, and he's talking about God's blood. He's using these very graphic and poetic terms to describe the Eucharist. He's saying that the church should be centered on the Eucharistic rite, and the Eucharistic rite should be celebrated by the bishop or the bishop's delegate. So there are all of these liturgical overtones, first of all, and then liturgical undertones, because he imagines his own martyrdom, which is impending, to be enacted in Eucharistic terms.
Right.
That this sacrifice he'll be offering of his own body and blood will be somehow like the sacrifice he offered liturgically as a bishop in Antioch. So again, we're not even through the Apostolic Fathers. We're not even through that first generation, and we see that that their consciousness was centered on the Eucharist. The church was centered on the Eucharist. The written remains of that generation are deeply Eucharistic.
Wow, that's fascinating. Especially, when you put the Didache at like 47, that's a game changer. Really. It really is, because if you read the document, it's like you said, it's very liturgical.
Yeah. And that's not just me.
No.
That's Enrico Mazza, who's one of my favorite liturgical historians. He says that consistently in his book, 47, 48 AD. And Clayton Jefford, who originally in his earlier handbook on the Fathers, on the Apostolic Fathers, that he wrote maybe 30, 40 years ago, he originally dated the Didache later than that.
Right.
And now in his more recent books, he has been dating it to 47, 48 AD, at least in the liturgical portions, which are the portions we're concerned about right now.
Yeah. And so I think the scholarly consensus has been in recent years a more an earlier dating, whereas before it may be contemporaneous with the book of Revelation or thereafter, right? Something like that.
Yes.
Yeah. And that's important, because, I mean, if you read it like this, if you say, well, the Bible, the New Testament, it's not really liturgical. I mean, Paul doesn't really give specific instructions, so it makes sense if the Didache comes after. It's a bit of a development. You have time to work things out. It gets the church gets more liturgical after the New Testament, right? That's how one can look at it. But
go ahead, I'm listening.
Oh, but it turns it on its head, because you're saying even earlier than parts of the New Testament, it shows that the church was already this liturgical as the books were being written and prior to some of them being written. So, I mean, that's a game changer.
There's a book I'm looking for right now because I can't remember the author's name, but he's a Protestant pastor, and in a church that's not considered a high liturgical denomination, but I can't find the book now. But he goes through the entire New Testament, and he finds the entire New Testament to be suffused with liturgical language and liturgical concerns. You know,
Interesting.
he's finding it everywhere. He's finding it in the vocabulary. He's finding it in the details of the scenes that are described through the Acts of the Apostles and through the epistles as well. He's the one who first kind of sensitized me to the fact that St. Paul's most characteristic letters, the letters that are considered his Hauptbrief, his little work, those are Romans, Corinthians, and Galatians, and they're all concerned with dining together. That's the overriding concern in these books, and at that time, dining together was the nature of the liturgy. So again, Romans, First Corinthians, Second Corinthians, Galatians, they are concerned very much with liturgical matters.
It makes me think, kind of as you were, and first of all, it's interesting that it was a Protestant pastor who kind of piqued these sensibilities in you to begin with. I mean, that's very providential on God's part and very neat. You wouldn't expect that, but that's how God works, right? So that's pretty cool. I wish I knew the name of the book.
Yes, and I wish I had it at hand here. It's usually right here in front of me, and now it's not. But I will email it to you later on.
Yeah, that would be great. Then I could tell the viewers about it. But you mentioned Galatians, and there's the whole issue of Jews and Gentiles eating together. And I always thought it was just like, hey guys, when you get together for a powwow, like don't separate yourselves. Come on. But now I'm seeing it as, hey, this is probably a liturgical pronouncement more than anything else, and that it just, the light just went on in my head.
Yeah, you see it as Acts 20. You see it as 1 Corinthians 11. These are the kinds of solemn meals, the solemn banquets, liturgical banquets that the apostles would have been accustomed to as Jews, and that they would have tried their best to continue in the church afterward. Right.
I just had a thought, and it just escaped me. Darn. It was semi-important. Maybe it'll come back to me.
Like the name of this author, it just kind of
it's
soaked up by the humidity or something. Yeah.
Right. So when you look at, for example, in the New Testament, you have deacons. What role did they play early on? Like maybe in the apostolic and sub-apostolic age, but shortly after the apostles. Like what would a deacon have done?
Well, you find Ignatius of Antioch speaking of them as beloved. That they are beloved. I say that the deacons had this paradoxical prestige in the early church because obviously their name means service. They're the ones who are offering service, liturgical service, as when we say, we're going to a worship service.
Right.
But also, they offered service in the community. They're the ones who took care of the poor. They're the ones who dispensed from the church's treasury. So you find these early saints like Lawrence who were deacons and were beloved by everyone. Again, the paradoxical prestige. Jerome once, Jerome was this kind of snarky guy.
Yeah.
And he once quipped that whenever a bishop wants to put an uppity deacon in his place, he promotes him to priesthood. He ordains him a priest. So that's the way to neutralize him. Nobody will like him after that.
Right.
But when you look at the roles of the papacy in the earliest Christian centuries, the popes whose early lives we know are overwhelmingly deacons. It seems, historians say, that the majority of popes who were elected during the patristic era were elected from the ranks of the deacons, not from the ranks of the presbyters. It was the deacons. They were the ones who were administering the outreach to the poor. They were the ones who were best known because the priests were offering the liturgy during times of persecution. The priests were public members of the church, as were the bishops, the popes.
Right.
But the deacons were the ones, they were considered the long arm of the bishop. They were the one going out and visiting the poor, getting to know the people of the church, and conveying the facts on the ground to the bishop. So the deacons had this wonderful place, again, this paradoxical prestige, because their lives were lives given utterly to service, and yet they were the most revered. They were the most beloved people in the church.
Interesting. So they really had a prominent role in the community. I wasn't really aware of that, because I mean, at least from what I observe now, it's like they kind of take a back seat. I mean, everybody's focused on their parish priest, but I think the deacon a lot of times in the role of the deacon gets overshadowed. I mean, if you were to ask your average Catholic on the street, what is the role of the deacon? Why is he important? You might come up with a variety of answers and a lot of silence.
I think that's because today we tend to think of things in terms of administrative authority and administrative power, and a bishop and a priest. Well, they have authority and power that they wield, all right, and they hold these public offices. Whereas the deacons are going about their work quietly, humbly, getting the thing done, and helping people to have a little bit more comfort in their lives, a little bit more consolation in their lives. They really are acting the way they did in the early church as the long arm of the church, reaching into the homes, going and visiting the people who can't get to church, and so on. And of course, they do exercise liturgical roles today, as they did in the early church. The deacons proclaimed the gospel. They preached in the course of the liturgy, and some of them were quite famous as preachers. When we think about the early deacons, Ephraim of Syria comes to mind, and he was one of the greatest preachers of the patristic era.
Right.
Just a remarkable guy. So many of his homilies are cast in verse, and some of them are sung, and they still survive today after 1,500 years, and they read as fresh as the day they were written.
Wow. Yeah. Saint Ephraim of Syria, for sure. His hymns on paradise are incredible.
Yes. And again, talk about deeply liturgical. And I know your interest in the temple, of course. He's someone who's very much cited whenever we talk about temple theology.
Absolutely. Speaking on deacons, in the New Testament, Phoebe is called a deacon. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to send this to you, but I think I forgot. I know you're not a visual guy online, but fascinating recreation of a 4th century mass in Italy. It was about a 5-minute clip.
Oh, wow.
And it was really well done. But interestingly enough, I saw so you had the altar, and then you had the priest behind the altar with an assistant. I don't know if it was a deacon, but in the corner, of the room, but close to the altar, you had a woman. She had her head covered. And when the priest would make the orans posture and prayer, she would copy him. And I couldn't discern what her role was. I asked somebody in the comments. They said she was a deacon. Another person said she was of the Order of Widows. So I'm kind of a little bit confused. I mean, I know with regards to house churches, a lot of them belong to, if I'm not mistaken anyway, powerful women figures. And so they weren't the type to take the back seat, and they would have been maybe present at the liturgy in a prominent way. This is somebody else's comments that I'm sort of rehashing. Not that they would have offered the Eucharistic sacrifice or anything, but I think I read in a book that at least in the Byzantine liturgy, she would have been seated close to the bishop in the early era. I don't know if that rings any bells.
Well, some bells, all kinds of bells. One is what you described does seem to be a description of some of the early paintings that are suggestive of the liturgy in the catacombs, the fresco paintings that we find in the catacombs.
Right.
We'll find female figures there in the orans posture,
Yeah.
your arms outstretched. So I mean, we don't know what these paintings mean.
Yeah.
You'll see a table there. Sometimes you'll see them standing beside a man. Some think that there's symbolic paintings, and the woman represents the church, because the church is always portrayed as female, as the bride of Christ.
Right.
So the
Exactly.
woman represents the church, the congregation, and the priest stands in the place of, or in the person of, Jesus Christ. So again, when we look at a painting like that on the wall of the catacomb with no notes, notes provided, we interpret it as best we can, and I tend to interpret it in light of the available documentary evidence that we have. I suppose it's possible that a woman would have been allowed near the altar, especially the woman who was the hostess or the owner of the property.
Right.
We do have evidence of women in the sanctuary, deaconesses in the sanctuary during the early 5th century. Okay, so that's much later.
Right.
But this was a problem, for example, when it's actually the first thing that got the Bishop Nestorius in trouble, was the fact that he asked the Empress's sister, or the Emperor's sister, to leave the sanctuary. It had been her habit to go and observe. She was a consecrated virgin. It had been her habit to observe the liturgy within the sanctuary, and Nestorius asked her to leave. So we do have some evidence of this sort of thing from the early years of the church, or the early centuries anyway. If you read the Didascalia Apostolorum, which some date to the middle of the 3rd century, there are actually instructions for receiving communion. There's a certain sequence. And I don't remember the sequence exactly, but the virgins, consecrated virgins, were given a place of prominence at the beginning, or toward the beginning, as I recall. So were the consecrated widows, and so were the consecrated male ascetics. There were no religious orders at that time, but there were ascetics, both male and female, and they were given privileged places in the reception of communion at the culmination of the liturgy. So there is an awareness of women in these liturgies, and of their exalted roles within the church. What's remarkable to me is how different this is from Greco-Roman culture at the time. Because you really don't have women achieving roles of public prominence in this way. Women who are emerging as teachers and writers, and if you look at a figure like Perpetua, who's imprisoned when she's very young and keeps a prison diary, I mean, that diary was honored as something holy, as a holy book, and it was passed on. It was an instant bestseller throughout the Christian church. And she received this place of prominence and veneration within the church that would have been enviable to pagan women. I think it's true when Rodney Stark said that women outside the church must have looked at women inside the church with a certain degree of envy. That they could achieve that kind of stature as teachers, as prominent members, as someone with something to say and something to offer, because that was not happening outside the church.
And I mean, the fact that the New Testament itself, in our Lord's resurrection, it's the women who go to the tomb and are the first witnesses to the resurrection. I mean, they're important enough to be included as primary elements in the. I don't mean story as in no. But in the story.
Yes, absolutely, and that's a trend. That's a trend that continues through the early centuries of Christianity. Because if you look at the epics that formed Greek culture and Roman culture, the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Aeneid, what are they? They're stories about war. They're stories about battles. They're stories about fights. They always culminate in the big bloody fight. And you go through any of the battle scenes in the Aeneid, and you're going to see a lot of intestines being ripped out of people, right? You're going to find gory descriptions of death, right? That's what it's all about. Because the heroes are the ones who cause the most death in the opposing army and do it in the most dramatic ways.
Yeah.
We find something different going on in Christianity. We find that the early epic heroes are women.
Hmm.
Okay, they're Blandina, this this amazing, tough young woman in Lyon, one of the martyrs of Lyon in France in the 100s. And Blandina is able to withstand days upon days of torture, days after days of torture,
Wow.
and before she finally succumbs. Um, we look at Perpetua and Felicity.
Yeah.
So many of the early martyrs, we still remember them in the liturgy, in the Roman
Yeah.
canon
In the Roman
today.
canon. Yeah.
They were women, and they died not by causing death in others, but by receiving death, a death like Christ's. And really identifying with Christ in that way.
Right.
This is a revolution.
Yeah. A revolution that changed the world.
Yeah.
And I mean, the whole quip about the Catholic Church being anti-woman. I mean, yeah, we're so anti-woman that we declare a woman as queen of heaven and earth. I mean,
That's right.
Right.
That's right.
But yeah, so that is interesting that you mentioned. I mean, up until the 5th century, maybe even beyond, that women had they were allowed in the sanctuary. They were allowed near the altar. Some people have a critique of the post-conciliar church, and they say, well, yeah, women, the whole, and people are entitled to their opinion. It's fine. I'm not ruling on that one way or the other. I'm just stating objectively, if women were allowed near the altar in the sanctuary in the early church, this didn't take away from quote unquote priestly vocations. But now you hear the argument sometimes, well, if you have female altar servers, that's a step to, female deacons and whatnot. And ultimately this is going to destroy vocations to the priesthood. We need to have males only near the altar, reading and so forth, and kind of excluding the role of women. But I don't see that so much in the early church.
Yeah, well, Pius XII warned about a kind of romantic primitivism among certain scholars, where they thought that what was needed was a restoration of the conditions of the liturgy in the earliest centuries of the church. Well, to a great extent, they're unknowable. They're open to a lot of speculation.
Mm-hmm.
So they're the kind of things that we imagine in our cigar smoke, right? You kind of see pictures forming.
Yeah.
There. So we don't know for sure a lot of things about the early liturgy. The other thing is that's just because something is a later development doesn't mean it's a bad.
It's a bad thing. Yeah.
Chesterton had that great line: "Don't tear down a wall before you're sure you know why it was put up." Right.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And I'll use an example. I have a strong preference for receiving communion on the tongue. It's what I grew up with. And I remember in the early years of Pope John Paul's papacy, he would insist upon it in his private chapel.
Right.
And in the public liturgies of the Vatican, or his public liturgies in the Vatican as well. Mother Teresa also argued kind of forcefully for the reception of communion on the tongue. So those two were the dominant voices in Catholicism in my young life. And so I took them very seriously. And it's what I had always done anyway. So I just never started when we were given the first option to receive communion in the hand. So that's my strong preference, because I think we are learning a little bit later, and this is just my opinion, we're learning a little bit later why that wall was put up.
Right, exactly.
Because I know that in parishes they find communion hosts, consecrated hosts, put inside the missalettes. Sometimes they find them in the back of the church because people who aren't Catholic go up and they're just following their cousins or friends or whatever.
Exactly.
They don't know what to do with it. So they do whatever with it. And so this is the kind of abuse that's probably the reason why the wall was put up in the first place.
Yeah.
But you're right. So that particular custom of communion in the hand was there throughout the time of the fathers, and there's abundant evidence of it. There's a description in Origen in Egypt in the 3rd century. There's another description in Cyril in Jerusalem in the 4th century, and
Yeah.
there's a description in Caesarius in Gaul in the 5th century, or a couple instances in the sermons of Caesarius. So where he's trying to get these people to recover a sense of decorum about the Eucharist.
Right.
So if you have Origen concerned about that decorum in the 3rd century, and you have Cyril concerned about that decorum in the 4th century, and Caesarius, after a while, the bishops must have just decided,
Yeah.
look, we're going to mandate decorum. This is the way we're going to do it. So maybe we'll end up back there. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, just because it's a later development doesn't mean it's bad, and in some cases, it's very, very good. I mean, like you say, Origen and Cyril both were, yes, they mentioned how to make a throne with your left hand over your right, or make a cruciform shape or whatever to receive the king. But then you have to read on where they caution about spilling some of the precious blood or particles of the host.
Yes.
And eventually, I think in the West, we changed the type of bread used for the host. And so with that kind of came, it was contemporaneous with communion on the tongue, because you were more likely to get crumbs on your hands or drop them or crumble the host. So it was placed on the tongue to prevent this problem. Mm-hmm. And I think in today's sort of culture of carelessness, and we've lost the sense of the sacred for the most part, not only outside of the church, but within her walls. I think communion on the tongue sort of helps reorient us towards the sacred, and obviously physically stops potential abuse, whether intentional or otherwise. Yes. So I think it's a good safeguard. But at the same time, I think people need to be aware that communion on the hand is not, in the early church, I mean, until, from my reading, up until the 870s or thereabouts, was pretty much the standard. It wasn't the exception. And so we have to be careful of saying things like, well, communion in the hand is intrinsically evil, or it's disordered, or it's an abuse in and of itself. Yeah. The church wouldn't allow us, wouldn't give us something that is good or evil and call it good. That's right. And if we're going to say that, then we have to indict many of the saints and the martyrs who received communion in this way. Would we say that they're guilty of sacrilege? Absolutely not. Mm-hmm. But whether we receive on the hand or the tongue, we should take the utmost and absolute care to receive reverently in soul and body. Yeah. And to make sure that nothing is dropped or nothing is wasted. Yeah. So that's obviously why that method of reception on the tongue was introduced, with good reason, I think.
And I think too, we have to be very careful when we criticize bishops, because obedience to the bishop has been primary. That's something that we see in the 1st century, 2nd century, 3rd century. We see it in the lives of the saints all through history. This deference toward the bishop, this respect for the office of the bishop. There's never been this among the saints. You don't find this snarky kind of talk that we'll find online today. Right. We have to be very careful, especially when we're parents. If we're speaking this way around our children, we're really alienating their affection from their bishop. Now, think about how we would feel if we found that our children's teachers were doing that our children's teachers were somehow alienating their affection for their parents, right? By telling them, your parents are wrong when they teach you this, that, or the other thing. Your parents are old fuddy-duddies, whatever it is. We would resent that. We would probably take action about it. Sure. We have to be very careful, because we want to raise our children to be good children of the church. And you really can't have that if you don't have reverence for the office of bishop. And you have to show that reverence toward the office of bishop. There's a lot of talk about reverence today. And it's usually about form. It's usually about liturgical form.
Right.
And I want us to have greater reverence when we go to liturgy. But we also have to have reverence for the authorities in the church. That's something that's been essential to the discipline of the church, essential to the unity of the church from the very beginning. And I fear we're losing it. We're becoming too much like everybody else on social media.
Yeah, so true. So true. I mean, we want reverence for the Eucharist, but what about the hands that give us the Eucharist?
Mm-hmm.
I think if I remember correctly, reading something from Saint Francis of Assisi, he said something to the effect of, and he was speaking of the Roman clergy. He said, even if you despise me, I'm paraphrasing, even if you persecute me, I will still kiss your hands because your hands give me the Eucharist. This kind of attitude. You want to talk about traditional Catholicism. This is the traditional disposition that we are to have. Yeah. Unless your confessor tells you to do something that's manifestly heretical or sinful, obviously you can withhold, but otherwise, right? You assent.
Yes. But even then, you don't speak disrespectfully of your confessor. You take it up in the proper channels, and you make sure that you're following through in that way, in the proper way.
For sure.
Yeah.
We've got some questions here. How are you doing? Would you like to take some?
Yeah, whatever you want.
All right. So we've got Humongous has a couple questions for us. I'll put them up on the screen here. So, did any of the church fathers or medievals write about Christianity flourishing in the Greco-Roman world as being providential in the growth of Christianity?
Oh yeah, that was a great theme, especially in the writings of Justin Martyr and Clement of Alexandria. They had a great love for their Greco-Roman heritage, especially in philosophy. Justin gives you the strong impression that Socrates was, this kind of Christian,
anonymous Christian,
yes, who received special illumination from God. Justin speaks of seeds of the word that appeared in these earlier authors, earlier thinkers. Clement shows this great mastery of Greek literature in a lot of different disciplines, and a great respect for it as well. And you see that continue to some degree afterwards. Jerome obviously was very much conflicted about this, right? Jerome has that dream or that vision where he finds himself in court and he's accused of being not a Christian but a Ciceronian because of Jerome's great esteem for Cicero. Well, through the rest of his life, I mean, Jerome might have felt bad the next day, but he related that story in one of his letters. But Jerome also kept quoting Cicero to the end of his days. He was a great classical scholar, and so was Augustine. Augustine was something of a patriot for Roman culture. We find him quoting the ancients over and over again. If you look at the early Christian poets, Paulinus of Nola and Prudentius, they take the classical forms and they master them so that when they are writing the earliest examples we have of developed Christian poetry, it's recognizably classical Roman poetry. It's fulfilling the forms that had been set down years before. So yes, I think there was a great appreciation among the fathers. At the same time, there was a caution because they recognized that the stuff of the poetry, the stuff of the drama, and sometimes the stuff of the philosophy was pagan. It advocated for things that were morally wrong, like like the inequality of slaves, for example, was something that you're going to find in Plato, you're going to find it in Herodotus, you're going to find it in Aristotle, you're going to find it in all the Romans. You're going to find advocacy of abortion and infanticide, just as you find the advocacy of slavery in all of those authors. So Christians during the time of the fathers had to show they showed an appreciation, but it was a critical appreciation. They made some hard distinctions.
Yeah, it wasn't wholesale. It's interesting because his next question, believe it or not, what were the fathers' views on utilizing pagan works? If I recall, Ambrose quoted venerable poets like Virgil with some authority, where some were more reluctant or outright opposed to its use, and that's precisely what you just said.
Yes, yes. And you see that some of them, like Paulinus of Nola and Jerome, were intensely conflicted about this. They had been educated in the classical tradition, they had an appreciation for it and even a mastery over it, but they were conflicted about it. You get to
Right.
Prudentius and you find someone who's a little bit more at ease in those circumstances, and I think Ambrose was more at ease as well. Uh, so much of people point out that that Ambrose was quite a plagiarist. He would
Mm,
often take the works of others because he could speak many languages and translate them into Latin, but adding his own material as well. So
right.
they're kind of a mishmash. But in the lectures that he gave to his clergy on the virtues and on good comportment and so on, and on the conduct of friendship, for example,
Right.
he lifted material from Cicero and adapted it to Christian ends. So you
Okay.
have this real appropriation that was going on. These men considered themselves Romans. They were
Uh-huh.
patriots. They appreciated their classical heritage, but they were perfecting it. What is
Baptizing it. Yeah.
yeah, grace builds on nature,
Yeah.
completes it, perfects it.
Yeah. And related to that, actually, I don't know if this guy's got a tuner in his head or something, but he's picking up on things as you're saying them, or vice versa. But he says, how do you think the Latin Church can recapture its Roman identity, and do you think Latin as a language will serve any purpose in this?
That's a good question.
That is a good question.
It took a long time for the Roman church to get around to using the Latin liturgy. It's quite possible that the church in Carthage was using Latin as its liturgical language a full century or more before Rome caught up and
Interesting.
translated the liturgy into Latin. That's so distant from us now. I think that for many years we had an appreciation. We had the same kind of appreciation for our medieval ancestors because they were the more recent past. So there
Hmm.
was a great appreciation of Thomas Aquinas and Francis of Assisi and Bernard of Clairvaux. I can remember seeing I remember I have a book titled "The 13th Greatest of Centuries." So there was a kind of exaltation, a kind of patriotism about that period
Right.
that we had as Catholics in the early 20th century and in the mid 20th century, and that was maybe the same sort of ancestor piety that was exercised by Ambrose and Augustine.
Right. And Tertullian would have been maybe the other, when we talk about appropriating pagan works and so on, Tertullian might have been at the other end of the spectrum, right?
Yes, at least in theory.
Yeah.
Tertullian was one of these guys who, if he saw a chance to get a good zinger out there, it didn't matter if it was 100% accurate. But he said, "What has Athens to do with Jerusalem?"
Right.
Meaning, what does all this classical culture have to do with us now that we have biblical culture? But you know what? He said that using Latin that was at the top of the game. All right, he
Right.
was a great rhetorician in classical forms, and he wrote from the classical tradition. And today we're grateful for that learning that he had. He was an adult convert to Christianity, and what we see there is someone who was formed as by Roman culture, specifically
Right.
Roman African culture, which was its own thing, and
Mm.
and he really shows us that culture at its finest. So yeah, I think again, grace builds on nature. We take these gifts of the various cultures, and with grace,
Yes.
we elevate them, and it's a beautiful
Yes.
thing when you see it happen in retrospect like this.
Yeah, that's one of the things I love about being Catholic, and seeing, just in the history of the church, how the seeds of the gospel get planted in all these various cultures, and we take what is good, true, and beautiful, and like you said, it's elevated, it's deified, it's baptized, and it comes to its full flourishing and
Yes,
expression, so that we're not all, uniform robots. And
yes,
speaking of uniformity, when it comes to the liturgy, I think some of us, for whatever reason, we might have the idea that, you know, the liturgy has pretty much always been, I mean, yes, there are certain constitutive elements that have been constant. For example, the celebration of the Eucharist, or, you know, the reading of, or the recounting of salvation history, let's say, stuff like that. But the liturgy wasn't this uniform thing, right? Like it obviously took time to develop, and it varied from place to place. So how different would, let's say, the liturgy have been from the time we discussed earlier, like the apostolic, sub-apostolic age, to right up the time before Christianity is legalized with the Edict of Milan? Like, even in that span of few centuries, was there significant development even then?
Oh yes, and we can see it in the documents that we have, that there was development from time to time and from place to place, and travelers would have been aware of that. You know,
Hmm.
people who made the travels, you know, and saw the liturgy in Alexandria or Antioch and Rome. Military personnel, for example, would have been witness to a lot of variety in liturgy. I would assume. We have plenty of records of what happened in the liturgy in Carthage, as I said, in North Africa, and how the liturgy in North Africa exercised an outsized influence on the liturgy as it was celebrated in Rome. Okay, a lot
Hmm.
of Latin culture really came from Africa, not from not
That,
from Rome.
wow,
You know, that the influence ran that way. Africa was a
interesting.
training ground for some of the great lawyers, the great jurists in Roman history. That's where a lot of legal talent came from. So there
Hmm.
was a there were a lot of Africans living in Rome, and they would have had their own chapels with their own liturgy as it was celebrated. So people
Finish.
would have been
Wow.
aware. If you lived in a metropolis like Rome, you would have been aware of liturgical variety, because you would have known people from other traditions. Maybe you had attended liturgy in their chapels,
Right.
their homes, wherever. Um, so there was an awareness of that. It's interesting. I in my book The Holy Mass, which came
Yeah.
out from Catholic University of America Press last year, I talk a little bit about development and the development that took place during the patristic era, and how Gregory the Great tried to impose some order on this in the West. And so
Hmm.
in doing this, in trying to impose a certain unity on the West, he moved some things around, and he
Uh-huh.
immediately got pushback from some of his own bishops. Okay, there's a famous correspondence with John of Syracuse in Sicily, you know, and John is saying, you know, what you're trying to do is Greek up the Latin liturgy. You know, you got all these ideas in your head when you were at court in the Greek capital of Constantinople, and now
Yeah.
you're trying to impose them on us, and that's not right. And Gregory really makes the case for development in the liturgy. He even makes the claim, which I don't necessarily hold,
Mm.
that the original Eucharistic prayer in the church was the Lord's Prayer, the Our Father. That it would be hard to make that argument, since we
Yeah.
have other Eucharistic prayers now,
The Didache, right?
right, from early in the church. But Gregory obviously had a sense of the liturgy's development in time and space.
Right.
So there was an awareness of this from very early on. The idea that the liturgy should be uniform in every small detail and every little rubric is something that's really um, uh, part of part of the aftermath of the Reformation, and really the reaction
Uh,
against the Reformation. Because what's going on there? It's a revolt against legitimate authority. And the
uh-huh.
way it manifested itself often was in liturgical variety, liturgical abuse, liturgical improvisation, these crazy things going on that had never been allowed. And so, for the first time in history, you have technology that can impose a certain unity on the Latin liturgy as it's celebrated throughout Western Europe. We have the printing press. You
Yeah.
can make liturgical books that are uniform and then mass produce them, and that's what we did. I like to think of the period after the Council of Trent as a time of martial law in the church. Okay, it's a time when you really have to have lockdowns, and you
Uh-huh.
really have to impose a harsh order on the church that was more severe and far more disciplined than what had come before.
Interesting.
But there comes a time maybe now is the time, maybe
Mm.
it's not the time, but there comes a time when you have to relax martial law. Otherwise, you're just living in kind of an artificial unity, an artificial uniformity.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. Like, so the reason for the straitjacketing of the liturgy, again, it wasn't arbitrary. It
Mhm.
was with good reason. I mean, it was necessary, right, in light of what was happening with the Protestant Reformation.
Yeah, yeah,
So, and it's the same way with the development of communion on the tongue, right? It was a development, but it was in reaction to something.
yes, yes,
So, and it was a necessary reaction.
yeah,
But we don't want the pendulum to swing so far the other way that we lose sight of other important things.
yeah.
Like a certain amount of diversity, especially from culture to culture, is a natural and good thing.
Mhm.
Um, but that's really what you said. Really struck me. About Gregory the Great bringing elements into the Latin liturgy that were Greek. You often hear when it comes to Gregory the Great, he's like Roman Rite par excellence, right? So he's synonymous with like Roman Latin liturgy.
Yes, yeah,
But it would appear that he actually tried to introduce elements from Constantinople, which is kind of counter the narrative, and then you have elements of the Roman liturgy that are more quote unquote Roman than what is going on in Rome.
yeah.
And that's fascinating. So what would a Roman liturgy have looked like in Roman Africa, let's say? Because I've never heard about this distinction before.
Yeah, I tried to imagine one at the end of my book, "The Mass of the Early Christians." The final chapter is a just an imaginative account of a liturgy at that time, and I think that I do believe that a Catholic from the 21st century would have known what was going on in the liturgy at that time.
Yeah.
You would have been able to follow it, even if you didn't know a word of Latin. You would have been able to follow it. You would have missed certain things. There would
Uh-huh.
have been no Lamb of God. This beloved prayer, the Agnus Dei, was not introduced into the Latin liturgy until much later in history, until centuries later, after Gregory the Great, when we had Byzantine popes in Rome. There were popes
Mm,
from the Eastern Empire, and one of the Syrian popes introduced the Lamb of God as a litany
interesting.
into the Western Church. So, but I think that in North Africa, at that time, uh, a Christian from today would have known what was going on, just as we do when we go to a Maronite liturgy today, or
Right.
or a Byzantine liturgy. Whenever my business took me to these other churches, or sometimes just on a lark, I would take my kids, and so they could experience the liturgy as it's celebrated according to other forms, other traditions, and they were exposed to it, and they always knew what was going on. You know,
Yeah.
they were kind of struck by the differences, but the differences are all in the externals. They could
Yeah.
see that it still followed the same basic structure as the mass as they knew it.
Wow, that's fascinating. Um, and early Christians used to, when they were sort of underground, they used to have mass in like graveyards and catacombs, and I wonder what that would have been like.
If you want to know, go to any of the places in the world right now where it is illegal to celebrate the mass. I've had friends. I have friends who've lived in Muslim countries where you were not permitted, uh, if you were permitted to observe your faith at all, you were not permitted to advertise mass times. Okay,
Mm,
that's not something you could do, and it was private. So it was the experience of pulling down the window shades and doing this in secrecy. And even very recently, in the United States, before we were the United States, um, when we were still British colonies, some of the colonies had severe restrictions on the observance on Catholic observance. So
yeah.
so the mass again could not be advertised in the state where I live, Pennsylvania. You could not advertise mass times. You had to celebrate privately, and you had to draw down the shades. You had to make sure no one could see what you were doing.
Wow. Yeah, and like you said, that's not a distant memory that we sort of have to drum up thoughts about or imagine. It's a living reality, unfortunately, for I would say a significant number of our brothers and sisters. And it's so easy to just, take advantage of what we have here, the freedom to worship. But in many parts of the world, they don't have that.
Yeah. Yes.
So they are living the quote unquote early Christian experience even today in the 21st century.
We think of the time of the martyrs as those first 3 centuries
of
Roman persecution, but there were more martyrs made in the 20th century than in all the other centuries combined.
Wow.
And I think we may be on a track to surpass that in our own century.
Yeah, that's a sobering thought if I've ever heard one.
Mm-hmm.
I've got a question here from Teresa H, and she said she's a first-time viewer. So welcome, Teresa. Thanks for tuning in. I read a part of the reason the time had come for Christ was that the Jewish diaspora had spread monotheism in the Roman Empire, which made them ready for the gospel. Have you seen evidence of this?
Oh yeah, there's evidence of it in the Acts of the Apostles. We find what does Paul do when he goes into a new town, when he goes into a city? He goes to the synagogues that are there, because the diaspora had synagogues everywhere. Even in the early accounts of the apostolate of St. Thomas in India, we find that Thomas first goes to the Jews of India and announces the good news. So there is a diaspora. There, from the rising of the sun to its setting, there are Jews everywhere, and they have synagogues, and the apostles go first to the synagogues when they want to preach the good news. We also find that wherever the Jews lived, there were people who admired the ways of the Jews, and they really did make popular certain ideas, like the idea of monotheism, which becomes really intensely popular in the centuries after that diaspora following the Jewish revolt in 70 AD. So you find that there are these people, these God-fearers in those places, who attend synagogue, and they listen and they study the scriptures, and they have great sympathy for the religion of the Jews, but they don't undergo circumcision, and maybe they don't observe the dietary law either. So there was already a population, and they're described in the Acts of the Apostles, of these God-fearers who attended the synagogues at that time.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, Rodney Stark, the sociologist Rodney Stark, believes that they were particularly prepared to receive the gospel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and let's not forget the Bible of the Church is a Septuagint, the Greek translation, right?
That's right.
That goes to show you there was such a huge diaspora of Jews in the Hellenic culture that there was a need for the Greek translation of the Bible that they could read in the synagogue, as you said. Yeah. So what did I want to ask you? Hallelujah said that was a great question, and I agree. It's a very important one. And yeah, like you see vestiges of monotheism and Plato, for example, with the good and stuff like that. So I'm sure you could see a connection there. I mean, and that's someone like Saint Justin Martyr with his seeds of the Logos doctrine, right? The whole point is that there's been seeds of the truth of Christ in the church planted in various cultures all throughout time, leading up to its fullness in Israel and her Messiah, and ultimately the church. I really want to get you mentioned this, I think it was it a rabbi that you mentioned at the beginning who had a commentary on Leviticus where he talked about the Mass and the connections with the temple worship. That was really fascinating.
Yeah, it's Baruch Levine,
Levine.
The JPS Torah commentary. And you may be disappointed because he doesn't develop the idea. I think it's significant that in the Jewish Publication Society's Torah commentary that he brings it up at all, but he doesn't develop the idea. He just kind of leaves it out there.
Right. Would you be able to off air at your convenience? Would you be able to screenshot that page where you quoted from, where it says that, and send it to me? I'd really like to have a copy of that. That's fascinating. Yeah. I'm not surprised by any means, but it's cool to see that in a Jewish publication, like you say. Okay, well, I don't see that we have any more questions. Did you have any final thoughts maybe for us before we wrap up?
Nope. I hope my final thoughts are all about that final perseverance.
Yeah, amen. Well, I really appreciate your time, Mike. It was great, and it flew by just like last time.
Yeah.
Hope you weren't too hot with your lack of AC. But yeah, thank you again. I really appreciate this. And one thing I did want to mention, the podcast I did with Dr. John Bergsma, we were talking about. I think it was in Second Corinthians 2:10, where St. Paul says, "If I forgave anyone's sins, I did so in the person of Christ." We actually stumbled upon a bit of a minefield in a good way in this particular passage, because we're talking about the apostles as priests, right? Not simple itinerant preachers, but actually priests with a priestly ministry. And I asked Dr. Bergsma, I said, because in some Protestant translations, you get something totally different. If I forgive anyone's sins, I did so in the presence of Christ. So you get the idea that someone's wronged you, you forgive their offense. You know that Christ is watching, so the right thing to do is forgive. That doesn't sound any really noteworthy in any sense.
Yeah.
So I said, Dr. Bergsma, what does the Greek say? Does it say what the Latin might say, like in persona Christi, like an actual priestly function acting in the person of Christ? What does the Greek say, just out of curiosity? So he read me the Greek, and he said, en prosopon Christo. So it literally says, in the person of Christ, he forgives sins. So there's that priestly imagery exercising the priestly ministry in St. Paul, which I found very fascinating.
The difficulty is that prosopon does mean face. It
face,
means person, and it means presence. It means
right.
all those things all at once. It's not just dictionary definition 1, 2, and 3.
Right.
Prosopon means all of those things all at once. So this is why that it's not enough to say that that I just go with my Bible, my English translation of my Bible, because you're not really understanding if you say that. English is not Greek, and you still need the still need the understanding of the interpretive community, because words change meaning over time. In English, we have words that have come to mean the exact opposite of their original meaning. So you have to be careful for that kind of thing. You need the interpretive community, and our interpretive community is the communion of saints. We read with those who are faithful, the martyrs from down through history, those who have been faithful, who show us how to live in fidelity to Jesus Christ.
Yes, and the magisterium of the church that Christ, who is God, established. And Joe says, not a question, but I love the show, Dustin. Thanks for sharing this knowledge from these great guests. You're welcome, Joe. For any who might be watching in Mike's network that aren't familiar with me or what I do, this podcast is now a year old. What prompted me to start it was my desire to show how the Catholic Church is the restoration and fulfillment of the temple in Jerusalem, specifically Solomon's temple. And I also get into contemporary church issues, apologetic spirituality, and that kind of thing. Basically, all things Catholic. So if you haven't done so already, I would really appreciate it if you would subscribe to my channel and share my content if you would feel so inclined. And again, this was episode 33 of Holy Smokes, Cigars, Catholicism, and Conversation. Let my prayer arise in thy sight as incense. I'm your host, Dustin Quick. This was episode 33 with my friend, Mike Aquilina. Mike, thank you so much for being with us. And I appreciate it. God bless you and everyone. And I'm going to end the broadcast in 3, 2, 1.